Assalamu alaikum and hello to everyone. Now the purpose of this short talk is to explain how God deals with injustice and what kind of peace He offers according to the Bible. The God of peace is just. We learn that from passages in the Injil, in the New Testament, like Philippians chapter 4 verse 9 or Deuteronomy chapter 32 verse 4, a verse from the Torah, the Old Testament. Lives of those who truly know Him will be marked by doing what is right and by peace. Both belong inseparably together and have been missing increasingly in the world ever since Adam and Eve's disobedience towards their Maker. Similarly to a snowball that becomes more and more intermingled and bigger as it's rolling down a mountain, injustice has increased to an almost unbearable extent. Who can stop it or avoid committing more wrongs while trying to put things right? Who is able to determine truth from falsehood in the heat of battle? Depending on one's perspective, it can be very difficult to see why things are perceived as unjust by an enemy. The situation in Gaza is a case in point. Graphic media reports of small children suffering horribly under the onslaught of Israeli soldiers enrage those who are sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. Others who side with the Jewish state are saddened by the bloody and burned faces of babies, but justify what has happened by what they call collateral damage. Is it not just self-defense from regular missile attacks launched by Hamas, a terror organization that was founded with the goal to destroy Israel? Hamas sees itself as freedom fighters that are in conflict against a nation who keeps them effectively prisoners in their own territory. Now, speaking about territory, whose land is it anyway? Does the Quran and the Bible not speak about God having given it to the Jews? Have a look at Surah Al-Araf. That would be chapter 7, verses 133 to 138. Or in the Old Testament, we find a verse to that extent in Joshua chapter 1, verses 1 to 5. In fact, a whole passage there. To add to this very complex picture, Musab Hassan, son of Sheikh Hassan Yusuf, a founder of Hamas, recently announced his decision to follow Jesus. And he wants to do that as described in the Bible. Musab was appalled when he found out that Hamas reigns in terror and was not even shying away from torturing and killing its own members. What kind of freedom do they propagate? Jesus' command to his followers to love their enemies compelled Musab, one of the leaders of the Islamic youth movement in Gaza, to find out more about this unique and quite strange teaching to have to love one's enemies. If you want to find out his original talk about that, here is the link. Now, we have been talking about loving our enemies. Now, where is the justice in that, you may ask? How can Jesus command his followers to forgive sinners and love them? Would that not be grossly unjust? Indeed it would, if it was not for what God had said in the Torah. We read in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 35 the following. God says, "Punishment is mine, and reward at the time of the slipping of their feet. For the day of their downfall is near, sudden will be their fate." Punishment must be given for justice's sake, we all agree in that. Yet it is God himself who will execute it in his ways, according to this verse. In fact, he has already done so to the extent that we can justly love our enemies here and now, because their punishment has been dealt with by Jesus, the Messiah. The Quran too calls Jesus Al-Masih, the Messiah. We find a reference to that in Surah Al-Imran, chapter 3, verse 45. However, the Quran does not explain the meaning of this term. Neither does it provide the reason why this title was exclusively given to him. To Jesus, that is. In contrast to that obscurity, the Messiah fulfills a central role in the biblical revelations. The Hebrew word means anointed one, translated into English as Christ. The term has been used in different ways on different occasions, mapping out the work of the one to come, foreshadowing the ultimate Messiah. He is chosen by God, we read. He saves his people. He judges God's enemies and will eventually rule all the nations in justice and righteousness for eternity. He, this ultimate Messiah, is described as a godlike figure, living in heaven and becoming a man who took the punishment for sin that we deserved. Now, if you want to look up the references for all what I just said, how I described the Messiah, please look at the Old Testament, at the Torah, Isaiah, for example, chapter 9, verses 6 to 7, and chapter 53, verses 1 to 12. Also consult Daniel, another book in the Old Testament, in the Torah, chapter 7, verse 13 to 14. Now, what are the practical implications of all this in this terrible time of suffering at the moment? The good news is that peace is possible. In Gaza and in all other places of conflict, because justice has been done by God himself. However, what happens if God's peace plan is rejected, you may ask? In the Injil, we read in Romans chapter 12, verse 18, "As far as it is possible for you, be at peace with all men." God is incredibly generous, and his offer extends to everyone, but it will only be enjoyed by people who accept it. Forgiveness and love can be passed on only by those alone who have experienced them in their own lives with God's help. He has empowered governments to keep law and order with forceful means if necessary. Just read the Injil, Romans chapter 13, verses 1 to 8, and you will see that. Authorities who fulfill their purpose will act on behalf of those who are oppressed, no doubt about that. If they do not, then God will punish them severely on the day of judgment with everlasting hell. The same will happen to everyone else who refuses his ways. Another question that may be asked at this terrible time: what should be done in the meantime by those who have accepted God's justice and therefore experience his peace through Jesus Christ? That state of completeness, the state of peace and well-being, is not dependent on circumstances, but on the relationship they have with their Savior. People groups, nations who stubbornly refuse to be set free from the prison of their own hatred and selfishness will have to be confronted with peaceful, good and persuasive means. An example of this would be Martin Luther King and how he achieved freedom from slavery in the United States. Now, this may be a long and painful process which can be endured only by not losing sight of the way of Jesus, who prepared a place for them in paradise. It is their final and everlasting homeland, remember? May the God of peace be with you as you get to know his justice.